What do you think would happen if you invited an individual who'd been living on the street for many years, had mental health issues, and was an alcoholic, to move directly from the street into housing? We had heard this was being done in New York City, and we wondered, and it was called the Housing First model, and we wondered if it would work in Utah. So to make that determination, we decided to create a pilot. And Kita was one of the 17 chronically homeless individuals we included in this pilot. She had been on the street for 20 plus years, had mental health, and was a severe alcoholic. The first night in her apartment, she put her belongings on the bed and slept on the floor. The next 3 nights, she slept out by the dumpster near the apartment building. With the aid of her case manager, she moved back into her apartment, but continued to sleep on the floor for several nights. It took over 2 weeks for her to develop enough trust and confidence that this apartment was hers and would not be taken away from her before she would start sleeping in the bed. Homelessness is a continuing challenge for many cities throughout our country. Our homeless population falls into 3 major categories. Those that are temporarily homeless, about 75%. Those that are episodically homeless, about 10%. And those that are chronically homeless, about 15%. Chronic homelessness is defined as an unaccompanied adult who has been continuously homeless for a year or more than 4 times homeless in 3 years, that totals 365 days. This small 15% of our homeless population can consume 50 to 60% of the homeless resources available in a community. In addition, they can cost the community $20,000 to $45,000 a year per person in emergency services costs, such as EMT runs, emergency room visits, as many of you will be aware, addictions, interactions with the police, jail time. Simply put, this small population costs a lot. Based on this reality, the U.S. government began an initiative in 2003 inviting states and cities and counties to develop a plan to end chronic homelessness in a 10-year period. The state of Utah accepted this invitation, and I was asked to lead this effort. In 2005, we approved a 10-year plan, and 10 years later, in 2015, we reported a reduction in our chronic homeless population of 91% statewide. That's amazing. When I began this process, and we began this process, I realized that I had a limited understanding of homelessness and the factors that impacted it, and that I needed a fairly major change in my belief, in my thinking. Because I had been raised with the theory of rugged individualism and pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That philosophy came from being raised on our family's cattle ranch in a small town in the western desert of Utah. On the ranch, you learn nothing takes priority over caring for the cattle. Something always needs fixing, and most importantly, hard work makes the world right. It's through that lens that I would see homeless people. When as a teenager, our family would go into Salt Lake City, and I would see these homeless people, hobos we called them then, sitting around on the street, and I would think, you lazy bums, get a job. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. After high school, I left the ranch, graduated from college, went to work for Ford Motor Company for several years, then got a job with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and moved back to Salt Lake City. During that employment, I had the opportunity to be loaned out to the state's largest homeless shelter to assist them in developing and improving their financial and management capabilities. While there, I became aware of a new approach to dealing with homeless individuals and drug addicts. It was called the harm reduction model, and it consisted of passing out clean needles and condoms. And I thought, now that is one stupid idea. That's just going to encourage them to continue that behavior. Just tell them to stop. Several years later, I read some of the early 10-year plans to end chronic homelessness promoted by the federal government. As I read through those plans, I thought, This is unrealistic. You can't end homelessness. There's too many personal choices and factors beyond our control. My perspective changed, however, when I attended a conference in 2003 where I learned the reason behind the 10-year plan. First was this small population of the homeless group that was 15% and were very expensive. That made sense for a conservative state like Utah. Second insight was learning about this housing first, or low barrier housing. There had been an agency in New York City that had been inviting mentally ill homeless individuals to move directly from the street into housing. And they were also allowed to continue to use drugs and to drink, just like we can in our homes. They were, in addition, offered services, not required to use them, by on-site case managers to assist them to adjust to the new living arrangements and to stabilize their lives. They were using the harm reduction model. And despite my initial low expectations about hearing about this model, they were having an astonishing success rate of 85% were still housed after 12 months. The third insight was the importance of developing a trusting relationship. Because of the abuse these individuals have had throughout most of their life, they hardly trust anybody. And that clean needles and condoms and low barrier housing was a means to begin to develop a relationship of trust. Vital. So as I flew home from this conference, sitting in the plane looking out the window, I realized my understanding and perspective about homelessness was shifting. As I stared out that window, this very strong feeling and thought came to me that if there's any state in the Union that could end chronic homelessness, it was the state of Utah. Because there's an underlying feeling and desire and willingness to collaborate to serve our neighbors, including those who are homeless. A new vision was becoming clear to me how this could be done. Now, those of us that attended the conference said, yeah, these models will work in Utah. But when we got back home, there were many who said, nah, those aren't going to work. They won't succeed here. But there was, however, an affordable housing organization who was willing to build our first 100 units. But they had concerns about having 100 chronically homeless people in one location. So to address that concern, we decided to create a pilot to test that idea while we built the first 100 units. And we'd use existing units scattered throughout Salt Lake City. Then we debated, okay, should we select fairly high-functioning homeless persons or the most challenging ones we could find? And this is where my background on the ranch came into play. Back then, my mother cooked our meals and heated the water for our weekly bath on a wood-burning and coal-burning stove. And after chopping wood for that stove all those years, I'd learned to chop the big end of the log first when I had the most energy. We decided to use the big end of the log first approach and selected 17 of the most challenging, difficult, chronically homeless people we could find because we knew we would learn the most from them. 22 months later, all 17 were still housed, including Kita, who today, 11 years later, is sleeping in her own bed and is sober. At the end of this pilot, one of the young case managers said, we used to debate up at our university classes which theory of case management was the most effective. Now our theory of case management is anything necessary to keep them housed. We became believers and built hundreds of units over those next 10 years, leading to the reduction of our statewide chronic homeless population of 91%.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Welcome to Understanding Housing First. Tonight we have a bit of a new program for you. This afternoon, both of our attended panelists had to cancel. One had a scheduling conflict, another had a medical emergency. So the last few hours have been a little bit hectic, but the conversation about ending homelessness is so important that we cannot make this wait. So we were able to bring together a new panel for you this evening to discuss these important issues of understanding housing first. So we welcome Christina Miller and Anna Levin to come back at another time to fill in their parts of the story. But tonight we're going to welcome, as the first part of this conversation, Sharon Rapport from the Corporation for Supportive Housing, who is the California Policy Director for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And also we have Dr. Sam Tsemberis from Pathways Housing First in New York City. This is a very, very incredible program that we were able to put together this afternoon. And so we have the same program, different panel. But as they say in the heart of Screenland, the show must go on. And we must find solutions for homelessness today. Before we get started, before I introduce our first panelist, a big shout out to Pete Rockwell, who's working the tech for us tonight, who's hosting us to make sure that we get as many people on the Zoom as possible. So thank you, Pete, for your contribution to tonight's event. And let's start. I'm going to first invite, if I can find her on my list here, I'm going to invite Sharon Rapport from, and let me pin you here so we can, and ask you to unmute. Can I ask you to unmute? There we go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Hi, Sharon. Welcome this evening. Thank you so much for being here, coming in at the last minute to talk to us about Housing First. So, without trying to steal any of your thunder, could you tell us how you understand what Housing First is? What is its definition, and how is it to be implemented? Sharon, I leave it to you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. And if it's okay with you, Mark, I'll bring up my PowerPoint and share that with everybody.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can you all see that?
It's starting to share. Here it is, yes.
Okay, all right, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I do have a PowerPoint, but please feel free to interrupt me with questions. And Sam Tsemberis is just, the epitome of knowledge when it comes to Housing First, so I'm sure he'll be able to answer any questions I cannot, or hopefully he can join in answering questions.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning from both of you this evening.
Well, thank you. So I can start off with just a little bit about my organization, and then I can answer your question. I'm with the Corporation for Supportive Housing. As you said, I am the director of state policy in California, which just means I work on trying to pass legislation in California to create housing with services and for people experiencing homelessness and try and help the state navigate solutions to homelessness. CSH is a national nonprofit. Our mission is to really try and promote Housing First as a model, but also to promote housing with services as the model to address the needs of the most vulnerable populations. In California, for example, I saw that Lloyd Pendleton talked about people experiencing chronic homelessness being nationally about 15% of the population. Here in California, it's much higher. It's almost 30%. It's like about 28% of our homeless population. About 40% of the nation's chronically homeless population lives in California. So a lot of what we do is really to promote models to serve that population plus others who need intensive services in housing. And we don't actually build housing or provide services, but we do do a lot of capacity building and technical assistance. We do policy work like I do, and then we do lending to nonprofit developers to create supportive housing. So in answer to your question around what is Housing First, it really boils down to Housing First being an evidence-based model to get people experiencing homelessness into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And permanent housing is just housing without a limit on length of stay. So people wouldn't have to move out at some point in time, that is their home. It's housing without preconditions, and it connects people or offers people voluntary services, which just means the provider, the housing provider, has to offer services and engage people to participate. But in the end, the tenants do not, they have a choice. They do not have to participate. There's no coercion to force them to participate in the services. And the services are geared toward providing housing stability. So and CSH talks about two components of Housing First. One is quickly rehousing people, and the second is providing housing-focused services. I really like to think about Housing First as really promoting Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we know that in order to reach our full potential, we first have to start with our basic physiological needs for housing, food, water, clothing, and sleep or rest. And so in order to achieve employment, improvements in our health conditions, addressing our own harmful behaviors, any of the activities that get us to full potential, we first have to address our physiological needs. And then, I like to compare kind of the old model of Housing Ready with Housing First, whereas the old model pretty much had like a continuum where people had to first access shelter. And then if shelter staff at some point deemed them ready, they can move on to transitional housing, which was housing for 6 to 24 months, at which point people have to leave. So there's like a predetermined time when people had to move out. And with transitional housing, there were also lots of conditions that people had to meet before they could access the housing. And then if they failed to meet any conditions of the housing, they would be evicted. And so it's a very rigid model where people could often be evicted, and then, of course, they'd often return to homelessness if they were. If, however, transitional housing staff deemed them ready, they may or may not be able to access a permanent housing unit. And so at the end of the 6 to 24 months, they oftentimes, even if they did meet every condition that the housing demanded of them, they may not be able to access a permanent place to live at that point, and then they'd, of course, lots of times return to homelessness. So what we see with Housing First as a contrast is trying to get people first and foremost into permanent housing. It doesn't mean that they won't access shelter. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have enough permanent housing to provide everybody. So sometimes people access shelters to provide, a safe place for them to be. And theoretically, they're going to be accessing all the services they need to get them into permanent housing as quickly as possible. And then they in housing receive whatever services they need to achieve housing stability. And so, I think Lloyd Pendleton talked about the outcomes of Housing First, and we really do see that the outcomes are really successful, that we see people are able to stay permanently housed and not return to homelessness, which is the ultimate goal. So Mark, do you want me to, I don't know if you have another question for me, or if you want me to.
I actually do have a question for you, because when I read the definition of Housing First, there's 2 points that stick out to me. And one is that we house people, quote, as quickly as possible. And the other one, which you mentioned, is that the duration of the assistance is with no time limits. So how important is it that we house people as quickly as possible without time limits? And what do those terms actually mean?
Yeah, so the housing does not limit the length of stay. So somebody could remain in the home and not have to leave that home. Sometimes, you know, there are programs out there, like there's one model called rapid rehousing, where the goal is to get people into housing quickly, but the assistance doesn't last forever. They can remain in their apartments forever or as long as they want to. Most people don't stay in any apartment forever, but they can remain there as long as they want to. So in the rapid rehousing model, for example, the assistance is intended to last as long as they need it. Usually it's geared for people who don't need a lot of services. They may need like short-term services or medium-term services. They may have an income and they just need to increase their income in order to take over the rent. And so the assistance may be short or medium term. But the point is that the housing, they don't have to move out of the housing. The ideal is the assistance lasts for as long as they need it to stay stably housed. Moving people into housing as quickly as possible means you're getting them whatever assistance they need. It could be that they need a housing choice voucher. It could mean they need shallow subsidies, so maybe they have an income, but it's a fixed income, so it's not enough to afford rent. So they get a subsidy to just make up the difference. That may be as little as $300 a month. Could be they need, you know, some services just to get them on their feet, or it could be that they need, on the other end of the spectrum, really intensive services, like people experiencing chronic homelessness typically do, where they're getting a deep subsidy that lasts for as long as they need or want the subsidy. So it could be that they're using the subsidy for the rest of their life. So it's intended to meet people where they are. It isn't, as this slide said, it's not a one size fits all. It's really intended to provide whatever assistance people need to stabilize and remain stably housed. So that's the concept. It isn't housing only. It's not subsidy only. The idea is, and the ideal is, to get them into housing quickly by connecting them to whatever assistance they need. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, yes, it does. And it actually leads me into another question for you. But I did just want to applaud Kimberly Ferguson for doing it right. She put her question in the chat. If anyone in the attendees have questions, please put them in the chat and we will try to filter all your questions into this conversation. But please do stay on mute through this so we can manage the presentation. So thank you. Kimberly, I will get to your question directly after I have this follow-up question. Because, Sharon, you mentioned that we need to fit the program to the person's needs.
Right.
So one thing that I noticed with some of the programs that we have is that they're basically cookie cutter, where we try to fit the person to the program and not the program to the person. So how do we properly approach fitting the program to the person?
Well, there are lots of evidence-based services models out there to help, you know, to try to identify what the needs and goals are of the person. The model is very person-centered. So, you know, the individual or the household drives the services model, but there are some evidence-based models that allow us to do that.
So
However,
the ultimate goal, the ultimate goal, I'm thinking, would to help people get self-sustaining, to work through their case-by-case problems in order to be able to kind of get on their feet and be able to support themselves at the end. But there's also something happening that's happening right now, is that we're seeing that the cost of the housing and how much people are able to earn is becoming greatly divided. And as we see people who are homeless getting older, falling into homeless older and older, those people will never really be able to earn the types of incomes that would sustain the rent that's out there today. So to get to Kimberly's question here, do they stay in the housing once they get on their feet, but then pay rent for the housing? Or is this like looking for also a permanent support? Some people may need that permanent support. So is it kind of a both situation here?
Yeah, exactly. It's both and. So it's some people are able to take over the full amount of rent after a short period or medium term period of providing some subsidy, and they're able to then take over the rent and live fully independently, and pay their own rent fully by themselves. Some people may be kind of going back and forth, where sometimes they're able to pay their rent and other times not. And then there are certainly people who will never be able to pay the market rate rent of a unit. And so I do think that the intervention ranges depending on the needs of the household. And so whether that's somebody who's homeless for economic reasons, that the economic reasons are temporary, or the economic reasons are permanent, or they have serious challenges, behavioral health challenges, chronic medical issues, and they need they need long-term deep subsidies along with intensive services. The ideal is, to really provide whatever it is that they need. And so we do see in a number of states and cities and counties that that now there's a more flexible approach where some people are getting like what we call a shallow subsidy, which is just a small amount of money to help make up the difference between what they can afford and what rent costs. Mark, you talked about the costs of rent and or the cost of housing. Sometimes the model is, we build housing, and that housing has to remain affordable for 55 years. And at least in California, that's the time period that there's a covenant on the housing project that has to remain affordable for that length of time. And we, in addition, we provide people who are living there some form of housing subsidies. Lots of times it's like a housing choice voucher, or what people also call Section 8. And then they get services on top of that. The tenants who need the services get the services in the housing. And so that is definitely a model of housing where we're providing capital funds to build, we're providing operating funds through a voucher, and then we're providing services. And sometimes we're not building, we're just getting people into private market leases. So where the person is getting a voucher, and the voucher is going to the landlord to help offset the cost of rent that the tenant cannot afford. So there are a variety of models out there, and it really is dependent on, or should be dependent on, the person who is being served.
So there's two kind of follow-up finishing questions I think I've got here. The first is just a clarification, I think, is that once we get someone out of homelessness, we don't throw them back into homelessness.
Right.
Whatever housing that they do get, they're able to stay in that with support as long as they need, and we will work towards their self-sustainability. Is that correct?
It's with whatever supports they need, whether they're working on their own sustainability or not. It's really the onus is on the service provider to engage the person to participate in services and to make those services meaningful for that individual or that household.
And there was another question in the chat here that I did want to get in for you. It's about the way that we're providing housing today with these affordability covenants of 55 years. This is kind of the model that what's happening right now. And there's a question about making these covenants permanent, if we're able to get permanent instead of just that 55-year. And also, I would like to get into a little bit of the implementation. We might get into that in the second half of the program here, about that this project-based, this covenant-based housing is one element of Housing First, because there are like the scattered site housing projects that Lloyd was talking about at the beginning, using master leases that we'll be also discussing tonight. So that's another model that we could use to add to the housing stock for people who need it. Yes.
Yeah. So there's to answer your first question on the covenants, making those permanent. Lots of times, you know, that sometimes does become like the impact is that they really are permanent, because in order, I mean, it's a little complicated to get into housing finance, but generally every 15 years or so, a housing project has to re-syndicate. They have to get loans and funding to do improvements to the property to be able to be sustainable over the life of the project. So lots of times they're getting funding again 15 years later, and that funding also requires a covenant. So it's dragging out the term that the housing has to remain affordable. You're absolutely right that there is the scattered site approach, and that can take the form of either master leasing, where you have a housing provider, a nonprofit agency that basically leases a whole bunch of units or apartments from one landlord, and then they sublet to the tenants who they're serving. And then there's another model of using the private market, and that's just outreaching to landlords and having a housing provider basically connect. The housing provider connects to the tenant, and the tenant signs a lease directly with the landlord. But the housing provider is providing the subsidy to the landlord, the difference between what the tenant can contribute to rent and what the rent is. So that's another model of scattered site housing. All of those models work really well. I mean, we can house a lot more people more quickly with the scattered site model, but there are advantages to the project-based model, where people are living more in community, they're interacting with other people who may have experienced homelessness as well. The services are offered on site, and it's easier for people to access the services. So there are advantages to both. And I think we need both. If we're really going to scale up to move the needle on homelessness in California, we need funding for both. Historically, California has just funded, as a state, we've only funded the project-based model. Now I think there are movements to also have rental assistance, that we could also fund the scattered site model more. There are multiple components to Housing First. It's includes like low barriers. So I think Lloyd Pendleton talked about this, getting people into housing without a lot of barriers to them moving into housing. So that's when we talk about getting people into permanent housing quickly, that's an important component. the services being voluntary, meaning no one gets kicked out of housing because they're not participating in services. No one's forced to participate. They have a choice. The services have to be offered to them, and service providers are supposed to engage them to participate, but nobody has to participate. There's no consequences if they don't.
So I think that a big takeaway I'm getting here is that we really need an all of the above approach to come at this from every angle. And that is the best way to meet people where they're at and to get to their needs, and also provide a wider range of housing options for us as a community to be able to solve this problem.
Yes, absolutely. But all of those options should follow the housing first model. That's really critical because that is the only evidence-based model that has actually worked to solve homelessness and decrease homelessness. And so I just want to clarify that. Yes, you're absolutely right, all of that, but it should be following the housing first model.
Where the housing is the first, with all the wraparound services, is hand in hand. But we don't deny people housing based on some type of means testing or criteria where they have to meet certain benchmarks first.
Yes. And so like people don't have to get clean and sober before they move into housing. They don't have to, you know, clear their criminal record. They don't have to have an absence of evictions. They get into housing as quickly as possible. And then the other important point is that they don't have to go through treatment first before they get housed. So
and all those treatments are also offered through the program. It's not that we just put people in housing and just leave them there.
Right, that's right. So the services are intended to connect them to whatever treatment they may need. But again, participation in treatment is not mandatory. They don't lose their housing because they're not participating in a program. So housing, getting them housed and keeping them stably housed is paramount and critical to.
And just a final, dot on the I here. That also saves us money.
Yeah, it's been shown to reduce significantly Medicaid costs. So in California, Medi-Cal, hospitalization, length of hospital stays, as well as admissions into hospital. It also reduces costs of incarceration because of people who are cycling between our institutional settings, like our jails, or prisons, or hospitals, or nursing homes, and homelessness. That cycle is just going to continue until they get housed and get the services they need. So once they do get housed and get the services they need, over the long term, they're not, going through that cycle, and they're able to stabilize their health conditions. Sometimes, sometimes we don't see cost savings. We see what we call costs avoided. So we're avoiding long-term costs that people are sure to incur the longer they're homeless by getting them into housing with the right kinds of services. So there are all sorts of studies out there showing that we are able, once people are housed and getting the right services, then within the first couple of years, they're able to stabilize and reduce the costs that they may have been incurring before they were housed. And there are lots of examples of that. We have a program at CSH of people who have been homeless and then they move into supportive housing. Sometimes in the first year, they're just getting all the treatment they need. Sometimes they put off surgeries. So in the first year, their costs may actually be a little bit more because all of those institutional stays weren't really getting them healthier. So once they get healthier in the second year or so, they're able to really reduce their use of those institutional systems.
And it's funny that you mentioned that, because in LA County, when they did Project 50 almost a decade ago, It was a 2-year pilot program to take the 50 worst cases from Skid Row and put them into permanent supportive housing.
Right.
In the first year, the program saved the county $21,000 per person for the first year. In the second year of the program, it wound up saving the county $42,000 per person for the second year, with a combined savings of $31,500 per year for the 2-year program. It was a huge success, and that actually launched kind of that method model that we're using today, minus the scattered site, which we are actually, let me make a quick announcement here for anyone in the community that didn't hear about this yet. So, because we've got some very good news coming on the horizon here in Culver City and in Los Angeles, is that on Monday, I had a meeting with Councilman Mike Bonin in Los Angeles, and we were talking about a direct housing, a scattered site model for the region. And he said, well, geez, I'm working with Mark Ridley Thomas to do this in LA City. We're looking to do a scattered site model for a minimum of 10,000 people. And in Culver City, we had been working to get this type of model happening locally as well. As you know, we are kind of the center of Los Angeles all around us. Los Angeles is like the suburbs of Culver City. And so that evening, Mike Bonin sent a letter to our city council, and we went and talked to our city council, and our city council agreed that we are also going to start looking at a direct housing program here in Culver City. Some fantastic news happening right now. Oh, and Sharon, I do know that you had to go pick up your daughter at this time, so thank you very much for your participation. Just one other quick announcement to tag on to what Sharon was saying is that additionally, one of the things that's happening statewide, because yes, we do need that funding, is that I'm currently also working with our Assembly member Isaac Bryan to do a statewide direct housing program where we are able to get the funding for the local jurisdictions to be able to permanently subsidize these rents for the people who need it the most, so that we can actually build a permanent funding source. So before we move on to our next panelist, I see a big screen of people here. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it a certain way. All right. The question is, do you think that it's a good idea for us to have a statewide direct housing program where we fund housing for people who are homeless in the vacant housing that we already have at a cost savings for the state of California? And if you support our Assembly member Isaac Bryan champion this, I would like to ask everyone to go down to your reaction button at the bottom of the screen and click on the little heart that you see there, like that. If you do that, I'm going to take a big screenshot and send that to our Assembly member. So how many people think that it's a great idea to get a direct housing program statewide? Please put your hearts up now. And I see quite a few there. Keep them up. If they went down, put them back up. And I'm going to click right now. I just got a screenshot, got my heart in there. I'm going to make sure that we're sending a lot of love to our new Assembly member to support this on the state level.
Excuse me, my brother Mark, can you do it one more time? Because there's more hearts came up.
One more time. Let's put our hearts up
please.
for Isaac Bryan, please. 3, 2, 1, click on your heart.
Boom, hit it.
Yeah, we got a lot of love there.
Okay,
Great.
thank
Now, please, everyone stay on mute right now, because now we're going to introduce our second panelist of the evening. And you think that was good. Oh my God, that was a fantastic start. Like, can we get some love for that? Huh? That was a fantastic start. But now I want to introduce Sam Tsemberis And Sam, you're on, there you are. I want to make sure that you're pinned to the screen here so I can introduce you properly. Hi, Sam, how are you?
Hi, good. Good evening.
Good to see you. Now, Sam, you have been described to me by some people as the godfather of Housing First. Is it true that you have been working on Housing First for 30 years and actually wrote the book on it?
Well, this is true, Mark. This is true. I have figured out a strategy where I can make an offer to people who are homeless, an offer they can't refuse.
And what is that offer, my friends?
It's what Lloyd said. It's a place of your own on your own terms. You know, I guess Lloyd came to New York, and we worked together to implement that program in Salt Lake City. What Lloyd didn't say is that they had a combination of government funding, and also the LDS Church kicked in $100 million for that construction. So resources are an essential part of that Utah miracle. It's not just a change in philosophy. There's lots of people that say, oh, we're doing housing first, you got to do housing first. But if there's no housing and there's no support services, you're not really doing it. I guess let me just say, a couple of things that how I understand how we got to this problem, and then how we can solve it. We got to this problem because in 1980, Ronald Reagan became president and introduced supply-side economics, corporations are people, and basically cut so much of the government that you couldn't trust government, the typical very conservative Republican approach. Ronald Reagan's administration cut the building of public housing in the United States from what it used to be, 350,000 units a year, down to where it's been in the last 20, 30 years, about 40 or 50,000. So we have lost public housing. We have no public housing. People warned that people would be homeless, and in fact, they are. So in all of the building of permanent supportive housing, this or another kind of model that, we've maybe built 100,000 units in 20 years. We used to build 350,000 units a year. Okay, this is the United States. Things were at scale. So if we want to fix homelessness, we have to get back to building public housing. Perhaps nobody liked those big buildings, sort of ghettoized, but there's a $3.5 trillion bill for infrastructure. You can build beautiful green public housing. You can build mixed income housing. You can build all kinds of housing. But right now,
it doesn't have to be all these big, dense block buildings.
Yeah, not at all. Of course not. It can be integrated into the community, like normal housing, like you and I live. It could be public housing, and it's all about investing in that. So, that's the solution, period, for everyone, by the way. All these different kinds of.
Bring this up, Sam. I want to applaud you for this, because one of the things that we haven't been talking about enough in Culver City is community land trusts. Because here in Culver City, I think it's our Title 34, something like that, where we're not allowed to build public housing. We have to do it in partnership with a nonprofit. So one of the conversations we've been having is to do community land trusts, where our community can have a say over the scale, the size, the mass of a project, but that we can also have control over the rent and create our own rent-to-own programs, so that people who have been traditionally excluded by the race or income can actually get into our neighborhoods.
Yes, that's beautiful, actually. And I think that one of the things about the rent-to-own program and the scattered site housing choice voucher compared to the project-based voucher, there's a subtle but very, very important difference in my mind. You can have, you know, a big building and do it as a harm reduction building and kind of call it housing first. It kind of is, but it's really a large harm reduction building. The scattered site, but the voucher in those buildings belongs to the landlord, as will the building 55 years later. So people are not empowered economically in any way. They can either choose to stay in that little room, you know, or be homeless again, or figure out a way out. So they are chained
But
to
voucher is tied to the place and not the person.
and not the person. It's not portable. Whereas if it's portable, like it is in scattered site, if the person has a relationship or wants to move closer to family or move to another state, even it's a federal voucher, you can go anywhere with that voucher. It puts the control and empowerment in the hands of the people who it affects the most, okay? So, which is now my first point. This is the first point I want to make about housing first. And this is the one takeaway from me. Housing first is not about housing. Housing first is not about housing. Housing first is about putting people first and respecting the choices they make about how to get their life together. Housing first is about respecting the choices that people make about how they want to get their life together. That's it.
That's deep.
I'll tell you, though, why that's important, because first of all, it ends up being housing first, because when you ask that question to a person who's homeless, the first thing they're going to say is, I want a place to live. That's how we got to housing first. It was because we were respecting the wishes of the people we were serving, not because we thought it's a good idea to put them in this kind of housing or rapid rehousing this or quasi-housing that. It's like that's a provider approach. That's someone making decisions about what they think you're capable of or what they think you need. The reason people get healthier is because they have more control of their own destiny, the same way we all do. You know, it's like we try things, we have a life, if you're living in a board and care, I don't care how good your psychiatrist is, you're not having a life. You're having just a good psychiatrist give you medication. So you got to be living in a way that is empowering. And the way to help people live in a way that's empowering is to give them the choice about where to live and have the option of a real apartment. I mean, you can, this is the way that everybody talks about housing first now, and in many ways, it's not been scaled up. It's been watered down because people say, oh, you want housing first? You want to go to the shelter, or do you want to go to the bridge housing or the transitional housing? And the person says, you know what? I'm fine right here in the tent on the street. And then the story becomes, oh, you see, this person is not housing ready. They're not ready for housing. They're not even willing to talk to me about housing. But
I tell you, Sam, this hits the nail right on the head, because I personally have been homeless several times in my life. And just this year, I was homeless and went through what in California here is Project Room Key. And the first thing that they wanted to do was move me out of my community. They wanted to put me to South Central. They wanted to put me to Downey, to Whittier, any place except in my local community. And I had to sit my caseworker down and say, now I'm taking charge of my case and you're going to help me find my goals. And I was able to get rehoused in my community. But how many people have the gumption and the know-how behind them, having studied something like this, to even know what their rights are, to stand up for themselves? And so when we hear service resistance, I don't think it's really service resistance. I think it's funding resistance from our electeds. Right. And it's also not wanting to meet people where they're at and what they need to stabilize their lives. Right.
Have a hamburger. I'm a vegetarian. You see, I give them food. They don't want anything. It's anyway, that's the fundamental core of Housing First. It's all about client choice, okay? And respecting that and empowering people to make decisions, even if you don't agree with them. Even if you think there's no way this person's gonna, you have to give everyone a chance. They learn, and if they fail and they want to do something else, then it's not like a one strike and you're out kind of program, okay?
No.
The second thing that is important is that there is no requirement. We offer housing as if it's a basic human right.
Yes.
No conditions, no all that stuff, that people have already said. So it's about people first. It's about housing as a basic human right.
And also, when we take that approach, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again because it's so important for everyone to understand this, is that when we jail people, it costs us $75,000 per person per year. When we leave people on the streets, just with all these emergency services and all of this,
police,
it's costing
ambulance,
$60,000 a year per person. When we directly house people, it costs us only $25,000 per person a year for that permanent housing. It makes economic sense for us. And so what we can do is we can do the right thing and get a tax break too.
Yeah. You know what? I appreciate that argument, and I think it works well with conservative Republicans. But I can tell you, for me, if it cost $100,000 to house people with services and only 75 to keep them in jail, I would still house them if it costs more, because it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do. Absolutely. I'm 100% with you there. But
I understand. Look, you're in politics. You're in politics. You got both sides of the aisle, But I'm just saying, is this conversation between us?
Sure.
You got to do it. It's like if there's a treatment and the person needs an MRI, what are you going to say? No, the MRI is too expensive. Going to let them die. The person's homeless. They have schizophrenia. They need a place to live. It's our duty. It's our obligation. It's our responsibility as fellow people to pick that person up off the street and house them and help them stay housed. One other thing about the service piece, which has been talked about. There are two requirements, okay, and there are two requirements, and the model of Housing First I'm talking about doesn't have to do with these single site buildings. It's all scattered site, unless the person wants to go to a building like that. 99% of the time, they want their own place. You say, hey, do you want to go live with like 30 other people who had been homeless and have a room to yourself and you don't have your voucher? Or would you like an apartment of your own in the neighborhood of your choice? What do you think people say? It's like they may be homeless, they may have mental illness, but they're not stupid. It's like, I want a place of my own,
Exactly.
Privacy. I don't want to watch the same TV program everyone else is watching, eat at the same time, all this kind of stuff. So that's how we got to the model. And this is not me talking and saying this is the best model. I'm reporting to you what people who are homeless will choose. And so if we don't want to have people staying on the street or choosing a program, offer them something that's worth choosing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's how we got to that model. And all of the research about effectiveness has not been about those multiple buildings or the buildings that are, single site. All of the research, randomized controlled trials, have been about the scattered site program. Okay. And everyone says, oh yeah, Housing First is evidence-based, but it's evidence-based when there's a fidelity to that model. The evidence isn't about anything that calls itself Housing First. It's about this Housing First.
This is exactly what I've been trying to get into the ears of our community, is that it's the way you implement the program that makes it Housing First.
And also, if you implement it like that, you're going to get the 80 or 90% success that the program delivers.
And this comes from the godfather of Housing First, the guy who wrote it. It's not just me. I'm just listening to people who are wiser than me and repeating what they are telling me.
I'm not wiser. I'm just reporting on the data that we have found in research studies in peer-reviewed journals. This is not like opinions. This is not me. This is I'm just a
Evidence.
reporter. I'm reporting
Yes.
the evidence. I'm
Yes.
reporting the evidence from Canada, from France, from the States, randomized controlled trials. It's the most studied thing because it was so controversial. And the evidence is astounding. It's like amazing evidence. Like, we talk about the vaccines being 90% effective, or 95. Let's get vaccinated. We have a housing first program that if you do it right is 85%, 90% effective. We have, Mark, a vaccine for homelessness. It's unethical not to use it.
Yes. Oh, you're welcome to move to Culver City anytime you want, my friend. Sam, I've got another question for you because this is the question that I always get hit with. And no matter how many times we answer this, we still get hit with it again.
Okay.
How are you going to pay for it? Where does the money come from?
What do you mean, where does the money come from?
Where does the money come from to support these programs? How do we pay for this?
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Like, that would be a question at the federal level or at the city level, or what level? At the federal level, do people ask about $750 billion for defense? How are we going to pay for that? $12 billion for HUD. Oh, why are we paying so much for HUD? And when are these people going to stop taking money from the government? It's like, we have lots of money. We are the richest country in the world. We have so much money, we don't even know what to do with. In fact, the 4 or 5 individuals in this country have more money, just those people, than most countries. So don't tell me where are we going to pay for it. We have a tax structure that's absurd, that the billionaires and the corporations are paying zero tax. I was talking to someone over the weekend, works for Federal Express. What did Federal Express pay in taxes this year? She wants to quit her job because she has some ethics. Federal Express paid zero. We had a president last year who hadn't paid taxes on all the real estate money he's stealing from people. I mean, what do you mean, where are we going to pay for it?
Okay, so let's break down how we're currently paying for housing.
We throw a few pennies. We're throwing a few pennies. Even the Biden administration is throwing vouchers at us.
You're right.
They're throwing vouchers.
So here's a new
public
model.
housing.
Let's turn the model on its head.
Let's get, you need $30 billion a year continuously every year for 15 years invested in the building of public housing. That's what we need.
So Sam, let's look at this, because we've got another model that we can be looking at. Because right now, how we're paying for a lot of this is that we rely heavily on the federal government for Section 8 vouchers, for the federal government to put the money in for the housing vouchers. Now the county comes in and distributes those vouchers. And what they do is they put actually a higher level of means testing than the federal government demands to limit who can get a voucher. Because I guess there's only a certain number of vouchers they're putting out, so they want to prioritize.
They have this like coordinated entry nonsense where they, prioritize misery.
Yeah, and now another level is the city level, where the city currently does not put money into this.
Yeah.
The city does the zoning and the permitting, and we try to help a project base get forward because that's where our purview has been. And I hear this a lot, that we've never done this before. We've never put money into housing, so we can't do it because we've never done it before.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Meanwhile, the state is kind of like an absentee landlord. The state's kind of like hovering in the back saying, well, will we, won't we? I don't know. Let's prioritize something else. And now I want to ask, are we right to demand better fiscal responsibility from our local and state governments?
Well, of course we're right about that. But I was thinking that we need to make the connection to the public, because the government is I don't know what the government is thinking, but I think we need to educate ourselves to understand that we have had a real estate boom in this country since the 1980s. We've had a real estate boom for as long as we've had homelessness. And the more we build and the more gentrification that takes place, the more homeless people we create. All the homeless people in the country are on the West Coast, on the East Coast, where wealth has grown exponentially. Anyone that owns an apartment or a house or anything has become 3 or 4 times, the value of it has increased manyfold, right?
Yeah.
It's directly correlated to the number of homeless people. The more gentrification, the more wealth in real estate, the more homeless. It's not an accident. These things are completely related, just like, there's, the airplanes are flying, but, it pollutes the sky. There's gentrification, and it creates a lot of homelessness, and homelessness is not a big constituency and they don't vote, so we don't really listen to them very much.
So
I think that you can tie
Mhm.
a tax, and some cities have tried to do this, like what Darrell Steinberg did with the millionaires tax, in that Proposition 63. We got to tie like a 1% tax on every real estate deal that closes in California and commit that to building public housing. We would be out of this problem in no time at all. Like, it's not a big amount of money that would fix the problem. We just have to tie it to the enormous profitability of the housing market.
Yeah.
Of course, no one would ever pass that, but
I've actually been calling for a major corporations tax for our community because both Apple and Amazon, $2 trillion companies, moved in and are trying to take over Culver City. So I've been calling to tax them, but that's kind of a hands off. No one wants to.
Yeah, they're not even paying federal tax, so
Yeah. But I wanted to actually touch on something we spoke about earlier offline, because actually you and I are just meeting each other right now. And I'm so happy for this happy coincidence of us, discovering that we exist. I mean, you're my brother on the East Coast, really. You mentioned to me earlier about FSP units. Could you explain a little?
They're not units. They are community-based mental health teams.
Okay.
And there's a lot of them in California. In fact, they were started by the MHSA money, which was the millionaires' tax dollars. It was like a Robin Hood, it was like, take the millionaires' tax and then create services to provide support for people who have mental illness and who are on the streets. The thing that's missing from the teams are interdisciplinary. They have a psychiatrist, social worker, nurse, people with lived experience. It's a really nice model. But I would say more than half of the people they're providing these services to are homeless. So it's like, no matter how many services you provide, you're not going to end someone's homelessness by giving them more medication or therapy or support or love or comfort. They need housing. So, if we could put together a robust voucher program, like all these vouchers that are coming down, connected with the FSP, you mentioned Mike Bonin talking about 10,000 such things, connect those to FSP, then you have the two components that you need for Housing First programs. You have the voucher to provide the housing right away, and you have the FSP team that is already set up to make house calls and provide the support. When you asked earlier, how immediate is the housing? The answer is, it has to be immediate, like that night. So if you are in a Housing First, if you're working in a Housing First program and you meet a person who's homeless, you say, hey, listen, I'm Mark, I'm working for this new Housing First program in Culver City. I can help you with whatever you want. I can help you with whatever you want. A meal, you need socks or shoes, a place to live, anything. Because of course, I want a place to live. Is that true? Yes. What kind of place? I want a place of my own, an apartment. I said, okay, well, I can't get you that tonight, but I can bring you somewhere, like either to one of those motels or one of those room key. Like, the program has to be prepared immediately. That's what immediate means. Immediately get the person off the street somewhere, and then within 2 to 6 weeks max, 2 to 6 weeks max, because you don't want to wait 6 months or 12 months for now. That's not Housing First. That's housing eventually. Housing immediately that evening, and then working immediately towards getting the voucher and all the paperwork you need. And you better be focused on that. That's the primary need. And the entire work of the support team is focused on what is primary to the client, not what is primary to them. So housing is the first thing. We're working on that, and you get them into a place. 4 to 6 weeks would be a high fidelity program. If it takes longer, then you're doing housing first, kind of, And housing first is not like it is or it isn't. There's like 40 different checklist things about what kind of housing, what kind of voucher, how often you visit, do you match all of the services? There's a program fidelity scale. And the closer you are to program fidelity, the more you check off those boxes that you're doing it, the better your housing retention rate and the better the quality of life of the person.
Okay, Sam, so let's dive deep into this. Let's create our checklist. If you were to create a proper housing first program from scratch, what would be those elements that are necessary to have in that program?
We've already created the checklist. It's 40 items and it's well published.
Okay.
But you need exactly what you achieved on Monday. You need money for housing, right? Which is a rental stipend that actually get in the fair market value. And you need a staff of people that will look after the people you're housing, okay? Those are the two main things that you need. Then you need the philosophy and the practice that we've been talking about. How often you visit depends on how often the person needs to be visited. You drive the whole program by the person's needs. Some people are like, okay, I'm okay, I'll see you in a couple of days. Other people are like, I'm nervous. I've never been in a place, like check in on them later that night, check in on them tomorrow. You match the service support to the needs of the clients. There's a lot of talk about, there's no treatment requirement. You don't have to participate in services. That's true. You don't have to pee in a cup to see that you're clean and sober or take a pill, but you cannot refuse a home visit. And it's unethical, irresponsible to put someone in an apartment and tell them it's your choice whether you want to see me or not. There are two program requirements. You go into the apartment, you have to sign a lease, and you have to behave like a tenant, like anybody else in the building. That's, a lease. It's like a lot of requirements. So it's not like so easy for people, but you have to be able to manage the terms and conditions of the standard lease, or else you get evicted like everybody else. And the other requirement is you have to agree to home visits. Now, the home visit is not treatment. This is a subtle but important distinction. It's a visit to make sure you're okay. I just found you on the street. You might have mental illness. You might still using. I don't know if you're eating. I don't know if you're going to get depressed. I need to check on you. I'm not going to make you take medication. I'm not going to make you stop using. I'm not going to make you do anything, but I need to come and see you. And then if you're any good at this kind of work, you should be able to figure out how to help someone who's desperately poor, has mental health and addiction problems. Like you want to have a relationship where they're happy to see you.
And what you're mentioning about the home visits, that's basically the caseworker that's assigned to you.
Yeah.
And they may come out like once a month, once every other month. No, even more.
They have to come as often as the person needs them.
As they need, of course.
In the beginning, they'll need them a lot.
Yeah.
Like once a month, it's already the person getting ready to graduate.
Okay.
And there was a question in the chat about graduation. If you don't need the services, and people, I've been doing this program a long time, so I can tell you that people get better from mental illness and addiction. They get better from those conditions faster than they get out of poverty.
Yeah, for sure.
So what happens is people get well, they don't need the services, but they still need the voucher or the rent support. Otherwise, they'd be homeless again because they're still poor. They can't afford it. So
because the bottom line is it's poverty is the leading contributor to homelessness.
Yeah. There's no housing, and people don't have money.
It's common sense.
Yeah. So the graduation happens, on different at different times for the services, and the housing is quite different. People need the voucher support for a long time. So then you need a supply of housing ongoing. That's why we need to go back to the beginning. What is the root problem of homelessness? There's all this newspaper coverage, media coverage. Oh, the root cause is addiction, mental illness. No, it's lack of public housing.
Okay, Sam, I just want to get to a question it's a clarification question that's in the chat here about these home visits. I'll just read this and let you respond to it.
Yeah.
Seems like this is where the implementation details are so important. I
Yeah.
could see the home visits being carceral or like police if you aren't specific about how this is implemented.
Amen. It's a beautiful and sensitive question, because if you're doing housing first, you better not think that you are the police or the landlord. You have to think you are this person's sister or brother. You know, it's a loving program, you know, and if the person feels like you're like there to check up on them, or, you know, like judging them, they're not going to be home when you visit. You know, the whole program kind of falls apart. They're going to be unwilling to open the door when they see you knocking, because they have a door and they have a key and they're in control of their life. So that is going to affect your housing retention rate, which means you're not going to be 80 or 90% successful because your tenants are running away from you, you know? So that's where the program implementation and the attention to detail is driving the outcomes. You do absolutely, like the question says, you do have to pay complete attention to the details, the philosophy, the treatment approach, the person-centeredness, if you want to get those kinds of results. And too often, you know, people, you know, that's it. That's it.
Yeah. That's fantastic, Sam. Really, it's what we need to hear. And I am personally, I've done my homework, but I'm learning so much from this panel tonight. So thank you so much for that. I want to just ask another question about vacancies. Here in California, according to the US Census Bureau, we have 1.2 million vacant units, while we have 161,000 people who are suffering from homelessness. That's exactly, it's 7.48 units for everyone who is homeless. In the county of Los Angeles, we have over, again, according to the US Census Bureau, over 251,000 vacant housing units, with approximately 70,000 people homeless on the streets tonight. In Culver City, according to the US Census Bureau and city documents, we have 907 vacant units at any time, and just under like 299 people who are counted homeless in our last count. Right. We housed 9 people through trickle-down housing, by how much housing we produced. But last year, due to COVID and circumstances, we got 90 more people who became homeless. So we actually had an effective increase of about 27% homelessness in Culver City. With all of this vacant housing that is out there, I hear a lot from elected officials from all over the place that, well, we need a certain amount of vacant housing, that's a normal range, that 4 to 5%, that's okay. But when you look at the hard numbers, those hard numbers keep going up year after year after year. So how important is it to address the vacancies, the real existing vacancies in our community?
Well, to me, those numbers are so important, because the number of people who are homeless and meet the criteria for housing first. Remember, we're not, you know, housing first is not about all homelessness, but it can be. It would be just housing without services, right? So, you know, but we're only dealing with people who have been chronically homeless and like a little subgroup. So one of the resistances that people often say is, oh, you know, there's no vacant housing here in Culver City. There's no vacant housing in Los Angeles. And I've always thought that, well, there may be not enough to house everybody or affordable, because even those vacancy numbers probably apply to a lot of high-end units that are out of range for any government program. So even if you squeeze it down to the affordable units of vacancy, there are, it's always been my contention, enough vacant housing units right now. If you have somebody good looking for them, you can house every homeless people who's chronically on the street. I don't think that'll be a problem. I think it's, you know, it's a matter, again, of the implementation and operation details. You know, you can't have a caseworker going with the tenant who's been on the street knocking on a door of a landlord. You need an intermediary agency. There's a very good one right here in Los Angeles called Brilliant Corners. They do all of the property management for the Department of Health and all of that, so that social workers and nurses and caseworkers are taking care of people. This other group does real estate. You know, they go to the landlord, they reassure them that the rent's going to be paid on time, that there's a number to call. You have to provide the landlord support in scattered site housing because the landlord's taking a risk on housing a tenant, you know, that doesn't have a rent history. That's what I love about your master lease program, by the way, that, you know, they're going to be more comfortable master leasing to like a city or an entity than to an individual. And then you also have some flexibility about who you put in, and they don't have a right to refuse tenants. But all of that is,
I think, something we talked about offline. So let me just fill in for people who are listening. One of the ideas that's floating around, and it's getting a lot of traction, is that because there's always the question of how are you going to get landlords to work with you? And with all of our incentives, making sure that the rent is paid, that damages are covered, that the city, the jurisdiction has that connection with the tenant, so that they can intermediary between problems with having signing bonuses and all of this, all that already wrapped in. One of the things we're starting to talk about is to give ourselves the first right of refusal to rent whatever unit is currently on the market. If you're renting a unit, that the local jurisdiction could come in and say, look, we're going to take a master lease, and because you're getting paid, you're being taken care of, damages and all of that, that it's not a taking, it's not an eminent domain, it's just prioritizing the needs of society and paying for that, by the way. So just for a little clarification for people who haven't heard about that yet. But Sam, could I get some direct response what you think about that idea of how we master lease to get landlords to participate?
I think it's a practical idea, a good idea in that sense. I think that as a beginning, you know, and as a short-term incentive, but at some point you'll have to figure out how to turn the ownership of the unit over to the tenant, either through a housing voucher or some other way.
Like a rent to own, maybe?
Yeah, something, you know, just in your planning, you've got to think about economic empowerment of the people that you're serving. You know, otherwise you just, you know, you're just kind of, you're serving a very important purpose, but you're not helping people liberate themselves from the shackles of always being dependent on an organization and being a client somewhere.
Now, just to close out this bit, because this is going to be a very important question for landlords, is that in your experience working with landlords, how do landlords respond? Do they like the program? Do they not? What's
the landlords? You know, it's I think that there are, obviously the program works, frankly, all over the United States and all over Canada and all over the world. Okay, so there clearly are landlords that have a heart and care about contributing to their community. I think landlords who are, you know, not sympathetic or compassionate to the problems of people who are homeless, it's going to be very hard to get them to participate in the program. But there's plenty of landlords that see the business opportunity, and also, you know, that the rent it's a government entity. You know, we're renting on the low end of the market, you know, and these are landlords that every month they're not sure they're going to collect the rent from all of their units because people are like right on the edge. So you're coming and you're speaking to them about headaches that they worry about and they haven't articulated to you, which is, we are going to guarantee your rent. You will never have to worry about collecting the rent here.
So we're producing landlord stability.
Yeah, that's music to their ear. Yeah. And then you say, not only will you never have to worry about the rent, but, you know, we're going to be there and we're going to, if there's an issue at all with the tenant or something, we are going to support you, landlord, we are going to support you in making sure this tenancy is going to be a success. So we're here for you. We're looking forward to doing business with you. And we will, if all works out, we will have more and more tenants for you as we go forward.
And I want to get to Kimberly's question here real quick, because she brings up an important point about like the corporate landlord versus the mom and pop. How I kind of envision it, and maybe you can give some feedback on this as well, is that one of the great things about being able to work at a local level is that we could actually prioritize working with our mom and pop landlords, because those are the people who I would think would want that stability more than some big corporation. And if Blackstone or Blackwater or whatever they're calling themselves are out there, I think we could prioritize the corporations last in something like this and actually make sure that that landlord stability, that rent stability for the landlords comes at the local level first, so that our local landlords don't have to consider, well, will I not get the rents and all this stuff? Will I have to sell and move?
Yeah, that's a nuance. I would take any unit that's available right away.
Okay.
I don't discriminate against the big guys or the small guys. Just take whatever you can get, because that's what we need. Everything we can get, as quickly as we can get it.
Okay.
But here you have, if you have a choice, like the big corporation or the local, of course, go local.
Yeah. That's where because what I think is that if we invest locally with our local money, that recirculates into our local economy.
Mark, I'm totally with you. I'm just saying that it's such a rare resource, like get it when you can get it. Of course, prioritize. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying.
Tell you what, let's turn this over to the chat. I don't see any new questions in there, but if I've missed anything, this is for the group here. If I've missed anything, that a burning question you've got, please put it in the chat now, and we'll get your questions asked before we close up shop tonight. And I'll give you a minute on that. And Sam, let me just give you the opportunity to get kind of last word, anything that you think we haven't talked about that needs to be spoken.
Well, I think the only thing that I would emphasize is, given our conversation, I hope that you, and I know you're already a convert because you're advocating for it, but I hope that everyone comes away from this knowing that we can end homelessness. It's really not that complicated. We need all of us to work very hard to make it a very simple and very powerful message to our politicians that we know there's a solution. We have evidence that it works. Let's just implement it now.
I fully agree with you. And I see two questions in there. I'm going to ask them both right away, because the first one is just the 40 item checklist. Would you be able to share that with us or send that to me so I can share that with the community?
Happy to do that, yes.
Great. And the other question I saw was on, hold on, Kimberly, I'm going to get to, I'll circle back to your question there. Kim can ask a question about tiny homes. What do you think about tiny homes and how they're being used in North Hollywood? I don't know if you're in LA or not, but
I am in LA. Look, housing is like, I'm not, if the person wants to live in a tiny home, then, fine. But tiny homes are like those big buildings. It's like, don't make, people who are homeless don't need some special kind of home or some cheaper kind of home or some smaller kind of home. They just need housing like you and I have. We want an integrated community that looks like the community. We're not going to have, oh, this cute little tiny home thing, that's for like the little homeless people here. And this big building here, that's all for the people who are homeless. It's discriminatory. It's isolating. it's terrible. You know, I mean, if our vision is inclusiveness and integration, then it's housing like you and I live, or
And
housing of the
community.
person's choice. Community.
And community.
Community. Yes.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. And having, it's funny that we mentioned community here, because having experience on the street and interacting with people who were also homeless at the time, one of the things that the homeless community thrives on, actually one of the only reasons they're able to survive out on the street, is because of the community that they have, of the friends and the people. And a lot of these are these artists. We have a huge artist community within our homeless population and lower income community. And this is like the heart and soul of a lot of our culture, our local culture, is within our lower income community. And it's when we are able to just improve someone's ability to survive, to have that housing, stability under them, what I notice is that those people become more active in their community. They become better social participants in the community because they're already wired to be part of a community. People, wonder why I get so involved. It's like, community is the only thing that I have to give me actually a purpose in life. And a lot of people out there on the streets, it's a lot for them too. So then when we come and say, well, we'll give you something, but if it's over and there, if it's way out in the desert or something, that's why I see, and we're circling back around here to that service resistance, or that resistance that we see, is because a lot of people just don't want to be separated from their community and their doctors and their
right. It's not resistance. They're choosing to be with their community as opposed to being somewhere else on their own.
Yeah.
It's a reasonable
so I think community
choice.
is very important in that. And also, I was a very big proponent of the tiny homes until they started doing tiny home tool sheds for 2 people at $130,000 a pop. That's when I said, no, I think we better get people into real housing instead.
Real housing for everyone.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been fantastic, Sam. I think I've worn you out with questions. Thank you for staying so long.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed our conversation, and all the best. And I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, we definitely will continue this conversation. This is a to be continued moment.
Okay.
And thank you so much, Sam.
Thanks.
And for everyone who has been with us tonight, thank you so much for being here. Let's continue this conversation locally. Let's look for solutions and really believe that homelessness can be solved. I truly believe that we can end homelessness. It's just having the courage to do it and stand up and try something new. So thank you very much, everyone who's been here. And let me just put it on gallery view just to give you all a big wave. I see most people have their screens off, but good night, everyone. Thank you so much again, and we'll get this video up for the rest of the community as quickly as possible. Thank you again, everyone. Have a wonderful night.